everyone, welcome to Open Observability Talks. I'm your host, Dotan Horvitz, and here at Open Observability Talks, we talk about anything DevOps, observability, and open source. So may the open source be with you. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Logs.io, the cloud-native observability platform. Logs.io takes the best-of-breed open source projects such as Prometheus, OpenSearch, Jaeger, or OpenTelemetry, and offers them as a unified observability platform built for scale. For those joining the live stream on YouTube or Twitch, feel free to share questions and comments here on the chat. It will make our chat today much more interesting. And with that, let's move on to today's episode. We're 1 month away from KubeCon Europe 2023, now that we're broadcasting this year to be held in Amsterdam. And in fact, I'm really excited to share with you, our followers, that our podcast, Open Observability Talks, is actually an official media partner for KubeCon, yay, KubeCon and Cloud Native Con, and we'll be broadcasting the April episode of the KubeCon show floor, so stay tuned for that special episode. And so a month away from KubeCon, it's a perfect time to have a cloud-native unplugged chat with CNCF CTO, Chris Aniszczyk, aka CRA. I'd like to invite Chris. Hey, Chris.
Hi. Hey, yeah, hopefully you hear me loud and clear. So it's good to finally be here, and I'm happy we made this work.
Yeah, we've been trying to do that, and that came out the perfect timing. Just the episode before KubeCon, that's the perfect time for you to probably give us some sneak peeks into some of the intricacies of KubeCon announcements, stuff like that. So I'm sure it will be all for the better. And CTO we know CTO from commercial companies, but maybe just tell us what's a day in the life of a CTO for the Cloud Native Computing Foundation.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a little bit different when your product is essentially the community that you serve versus like a SaaS-based solution. But I think a lot of people may not realize that we provide a lot of support for our projects. So my team, we have folks that help with documentation, security audits, helping kind of cultivate and evolve project governance. We have developer advocacy, so folks that kind of go around and speak about what CNCF is about, what our projects do demos. So it's kind of all about all the activities you need to do to make sure an open source project continues to kind of grow in a healthy way. And so this is like advocacy, mentorship, security, improved governance. And so we have these folks that essentially focus on doing that, and that's a big chunk of my time, kind of working with projects, ensuring they're successful. The other bit is kind of exploring future directions, more kind of, I would say, what a traditional CTO would do, is kind of exploring new project and product related directions for the organization. As you're aware, cloud native is a little bit interesting in some ways, where we had that original cloud native definition, right? It was all about it's like orchestrating microservices, right, and containers. But obviously we have expanded outside of just that, right? We have things like OpenTelemetry, we have Envoy, we have service meshes, we have OpenCod. So I think the cloud native itself has kind of broadened. And so for me, trying to always kind of see what's next and kind of being up to date to see what we kind of bring in that improves the lives of our projects and users and members is something always kind of top of mind for me. So hopefully that's gives you a bit of an update. Lots of travel, been literally in Tokyo, Hong Kong, and Stockholm in the last 2.5 weeks. So I'm a little exhausted from that, but we have a great global community, and that's kind of one of the things that I really cherish about CNCF is we have folks all over the world, all walks of life, contributing and making cloud native better. So it's super fun to kind of see that happen, especially that we're a little over 7 years old now since our first board meeting in December 2015.
Wow, that's amazing. I can tell you, being one of the organizers of a local CNCF chapter in Tel Aviv, that you feel the different communities throughout the world, and the vibe goes between them, and the sharing and the community spirit. And so you have the central entity, and then you have the localized communities, and the synergy between them is really amazing. And you talked about the part that people see less. People see you on stage and reading your blog, but there's a lot of backstage work that you do in order to nurture the projects and to make sure that they're sustainable. And actually, I just came back from FOSS Backstage conference in Berlin, where I talked about open source and advocacy and so on. And being a prison of the moment, many discussions took place around the churn and the fatigue of maintainers, and how to get more people involved, and how to get the work-life balance for maintainers, especially ones that are not US time zones, when all the calls, the community calls and stuff take place in the US time zone, thing like that. I'm curious. I gave my take on these discussions, but I'm actually curious about how the CNCF helps its project in achieving that.
Yeah, so I think there's a few ways we kind of think about this problem. We step one is obviously we cannot kind of control the private sector when it comes to like who they hire, what resources are focused on projects, but there's certain things we could do to kind of help maintainers. So like one of them is a lot of time maintainers are like a little overworked. We need more maintainers. Why aren't we having more maintainers? Well, part of the problem is sometimes the project itself may not be as welcoming as they think, right? Or they haven't gone through the process of setting up governance where you have like shadow programs or mentorship programs and so on. And so we have staff on my team that essentially help, facilitate mentorship programs, which essentially help projects cultivate new contributions. And sometimes those contributors become maintainers. I actually had just before this kind of podcast, I had a call with the CubeArmor CNCF project, and they had a case where they literally had a person they mentored. That person became a good contributor. They just became a maintainer, and now they're mentoring individuals themselves to contribute to the project. So you kind of have like this beautiful life cycle,
full circle.
And that's kind of full circle, and that's kind of what we want to promote. And there's lots of stories like that in CNCF. We have folks like Nikita, who kind of rose from simple contributor mentee to now leader, part of the CNCF TOC, and helping many other individuals out. And that's kind of one of the core functions we do to kind of bring new people. Not all of them end up as big time contributors and maintainers, but some do, and they're kind of that culture of giving back. Other things to your point about open source as a global endeavor, cloud native as a global endeavor, we try to do our best to provide translations for projects. We've actually helped the Kubernetes community initially with a lot of the work to get their documentation translated in different languages by kind of booting up SIG-Docs and staffing up that to kind of be a community run thing. We've done some of these efforts for other projects. The time zone thing, always a fundamental problem. If your project becomes large enough, sometimes we see projects just alternate meeting times, but it is difficult, and that's a decision that projects themselves kind of have to go about and decide. We can't necessarily force a project to say like, all right, you have to do your meetings at like 6 a.m. in the morning Pacific to accommodate some part of the globe. So it's a fundamental problem we have. Other kind of little things that we've done is we have if you ever been KubeCon, obviously coming up. Generally, we always have kind of like wellness programs, available at KubeCon. So if people need to kind of check out, there's usually quiets rooms and other things. So we kind of generally have usually, a bunch of kind of wellness programs available for maintainers and so on. But sustainability is a tough problem overall, because each project is it's like the Tolstoy whatever quote. It's like everyone's unhappy in their own unique way. It's in some ways all happy families are like all unhappy families are like broken in their own unique way. That kind of applies to open source sustainability. Some people are like they're burned out. Some people it's like different problems. Overall, we do our best to accommodate.
And another thing that I keep encountering when I advocate for the CNCF. A very common thing is when people first meet the CNCF, they see the famous chart with all the projects and
landscape. Yes.
And then they get, frankly, I guess, overwhelmed with all the options. And this can get quite confusing for newcomers wanting to adopt cloud native stack and approach. So I wonder if you have encountered that feedback as well, and what you advise people experiencing that.
Yeah, so it's I have let's call it a love-hate relationship with the landscape in some ways, and it's mostly love. That the hate is minor, and that's mostly usability stuff. But I actually was just speaking at an event a little under a week ago in Stockholm, Container Day Stockholm, and kind of mentioned up the landscape. And someone raised their hand and was this like, there's just too much on here. It's very confusing. But they do find value in being able to see what the options are, right? And I think the reality of the situation is, I think people would like to tell you that, hey, you could just go download and install this product or distribution and it's going to solve all your problems. The reality of the situation is cloud native is complex. We're inherently dealing with distributed systems. There's failure, there's different preferences on different tools to use. It's a complex ecosystem. And I think the landscape reflects that, obviously highlighting CNCF projects that are mature, that are, maybe preferred options for people to explore. I know a lot of end user companies out there actually start with the landscape first. And if they're like, hey, if we're going to go roll out a IDP solution or look at, some new security thing, they actually kind of look at the options there first and kind of come into it as an exploratory, well, we need to update our security, runtime security platform. What's out there? Let's go look what's on the CNCF thing and kind of do that. So I think that's, it is useful, and it's funny, when we started it, is we used to maintain this stuff in a spreadsheet, locally, like everyone does. And then I
could only imagine that spreadsheet now.
It was ridiculous. So what happened was the former Dan Kahn and I were like, you know what? We're open source people. Can we just open source this thing and have the community kind of contribute and keep it up to date? And it turned out to work out, really well on that. The other thing to kind of mention is there is an introductory part of the landscape. A lot of people don't realize, if you go to l.cncf.io/guide, it's kind of it's probably a hidden feature. It should be a little bit more visible, but the guide kind of goes over and talks about all the different boxes, what's a container registry, what problems does it address, what is automation configuration, what is key management, yada yada. And I feel that is a great section that new people should especially start if they're overwhelmed. So definitely a little secret feature.
But beyond the categories there, which is very helpful to understand for those who don't even understand the boxes, that's definitely helpful. But what the other aspect of being overwhelmed is the amount of choice. And this is not about the form factor. I know that maybe the landscape could be differently structured, but the amount of projects that we have and the amount of options for each category is quite overwhelming. And the question is, for the advanced users, they know exactly what they want. They can find exactly the best fit for them. That's perfect. The question is, the newcomers that are less versed, what would you advise them in finding their best fit of stack for their needs with all this richness of options?
Yeah, so there's two kind of things here. So for newcomers, I almost will always recommend we have a great set of Kubernetes certified solution or service providers and companies that you kind of rely on to kind of be your experts there. If you don't have enough bandwidth to do it internally, I think that's always a kind of fair thing to do, especially if you're able to do that. Other options that we've kind of start with CNCF projects, is a very simple answer. You're upgrading your observability, stack. Maybe you're, stuck in the old ages and still have Nagios running, and you're like, oh crap, finally need to update this. I don't know, right? But start with maybe Prometheus and go from there. And then eventually, the CNCF projects are generally a good start and will get you far enough. And then sometimes you may outgrow them and then find a hosted or, product, based offering. And that's kind of a common life cycle. We see that happens. That kind of benefits everyone at the end. The end users are able to start fairly cheaply, and then as they scale and need help, there's usually a product offering or SaaS type offering that they could use. If they're advanced enough, they could go roll out on their own. And it's kind of a blessing and a curse in some ways, because, you know, when we started CNCF, our idea was always, we cannot have just one stack. Like, the whole idea was, we need to be customizable and pluggable, because if you're too opinionated, you end up essentially losing out on innovation over time, right? You know, there are some other great communities out there like Cloud Foundry and OpenStack as kind of two examples that come to mind. Great software, but when you become too opinionated, it potentially, you lose out on maybe some future innovations, in my own personal opinion. So when we started CNCF, we're like, well, we don't want to really be too opinionated. We want to have multiple competing projects, because that competition should allow for better outcomes. And we've kind of seen that happen. Like, you know, for example, container runtimes, right? We had, you know, Docker Engine, Containerd, Rocket, you know, Creo, and they fought, you know, in the container wars. And now if you look at it, you know, Containerd, obviously probably the mature option, and then Creo as kind of a, you know, has its own little ecosystem. And then there's, you know, Rocket, and then that fighting and competition actually has led to better standards. The Open Container Initiative, OCI stuff, improved based on that. The CRI under bits have improved significantly. So I think that's kind of worked out well. And, you know, it also happens in observability. I know this is an observability podcast. I was fortunately, unfortunately involved in a lot of the open census, open tracing, OpenTelemetry drama, and so on. And, you know, that competition turned out to actually lead to a better solution. The cost, though, was confusion in the market for sure. Like end users were confused about the different things. We're still migrating, you know, folks from open tracing and then so on. So and CNCF, we actually invested in writing documentation to try to help migrate people, but it's a long process. So I think that original decision has just led to, like, we're aware that the cost is confusion, you know, for end users potentially, but as a foundation, it's not our role to provide that one solution. It's to enable our member companies, you know, startups, large companies, to kind of build those opinionated solutions. And we foster the competition and collaboration to make it all better. And sometimes parachute in when there's like a open tracing, open census, or Containerd type, like that type of thing.
Yeah. No, but
Yeah.
I've been involved with in the past in OpenStack, so I definitely relate to that, and I think that this approach makes perfect sense. Another, by the way, thing that I thought about looking at the evolution of Kubernetes, you know, the gemstone in CNCF. Seeing how broad it is today, you see the edge computing, you see all sorts of cases, and for machine learning type of workload, and so many. And at some point, what I saw with OpenStack back in the day was that it spread so wide that at some point it lost its focus. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, you're best to see that as a CTO. If you sometimes think if it doesn't go too broad on the expense of specialization and you know, be doing this the best way you can.
So I think there's two ways of looking at it. One is, if I look at Kubernetes itself, you know, I think over the years, it's kind of done things to actually try to rip out pieces in, let's call it in tree, or, you know, part of the code base. So, like, you know, they spun out etcd, for example, a long time ago. A lot of the storage, you know, related drivers were in tree, and things like CSI and then, you know, CNI, that whole story was formed to kind of spin things out. So I think the lesson they took is try to keep the core as like simple and functional as possible, and try to get the stuff out of tree and have that competition and confusion happen on the outer layers versus, you know, in let's call it open, like in OpenStack, let's say it was very hard to just like replace Neutron. You're just like stuck with it, right? Like you're, it's just so, and then there's good and bad, like, but the flexibility to have that choice and competition does lead to a lot of interesting evolutions. And if I kind of look at Kubernetes now, it's maturing. The releases are slower. We've shifted from 4 times a year to 3 times a year. There's even rumor that they may go to 2 times a year. You would not believe how many people I talk to that they're like 4 or 3 times a year, too fast. And I'm like, okay, it seems
That's
like
how the industry works.
Yeah, depending on regulated industries for sure. But I look at this, I'm like, look, updating, being able to update frequently actually usually leads to better practices internally for your organization. But that's a whole other thing. There's actually one other person I talked to recently in Stockholm was like, we used to have this problem with web browsers, right? Remember we used to like download a new version of Firefox or whatever, Chrome. Now this stuff just like auto updates and we don't even care anymore. Like we used to complain about it. Like Kubernetes could potentially move to that model. That's a little bit harder because of where it sits on the stack.
Yeah.
But it's definitely matured where to your original point, the core stuff seems to kind of get simpler and simpler, or they come up with some abstraction like a CSI and kind of go from there. And I think that's been fairly healthy. I mean, there are definitely some things that I'd love to see change inside of Kubernetes. I think etcd is great, but I think there should be opportunities to use potentially other stores. If you look at for example K3s, they managed to get it working with SQLite, for example, because they need that in particular environments. I think that type of work should eventually kind of be, let's call it upstreamed or done in a way where we could just have one thing, and K3s just kind of takes advantage of that. So, and there's all these other little tiny things that I think bother me a little bit, but Kubernetes could eventually kind of evolve just like any other project. If we go back in time, like Linux eventually ended up in basically every almost form factor device embedded thing because people showed up and did the work to make sure it could do that. The other kind of thing that comes to mind is, at the end of the day, like, in distributed systems, you're orchestrating workloads, and, workloads often have kind of different runtime characteristics, but you still need some kind of smart thing to orchestrate those. And I think people have kind of come to comfort that Kubernetes is going to be that thing for probably 80% of cases, whether you're orchestrating, let's call it VMs. There's things like KubeVirt, right? There's, obviously we could orchestrate containers. There are people now writing things to orchestrate WebAssembly, modules. There are people trying to orchestrate databases. So I think, having essentially a pluggable, extensible API server that is available in every public and private cloud has its advantages. And I think that's like the true value of Kubernetes, is that kind of open, extensible API server and control plane that is available everywhere. So I'll stop kind of ranting on that and kind of let you.
No, it's a good perspective, and I definitely agree that the pluggability and the IPA approach has proven very, very powerful. And then you mentioned observability, and we're here at Open Observability, all about open observability. And the most fascinating, I think, CNCF project in this domain is OpenTelemetry. I actually hosted Alolita Sharma here on the show after last year. To cover the updates. For those who don't know Alolita, she's the OpenTelemetry Governance Committee member and also a co-chair in TAG Observability in the CNCF. So, and I discussed the project also extensively with other guests. So, and you've worked on the CNCF project journey report for OpenTelemetry that I know is really ready to be officially published. So, can you share with us a bit of the key findings that you saw in the report?
Yeah, so I'm happy to kind of, it should be released hopefully in time for KubeCon Europe, but we always
get the sneak peek
to kind of set the set what a project journey report is, from a CNCF perspective for people that aren't aware. Essentially, it basically tracks the evolution of a project from kind of birth to when it joins CNCF to kind of where it is now, whether it's an incubating or graduated project. So one thing to look at for OpenTelemetry, just like Kubernetes, generally, when you start out, you have one company, maybe two companies involved, and then it kind of grows over time to have multiple people involved. Like you look at Kubernetes, for example, to kind of map this in people's heads, is mostly started out with Google and Red Hat, kind of in early days, where they made up well over, I think, like 80% of the contributions. If you go stretch things out now, Google contributes less than I think 20-25% now to the overall Kubernetes code base, but their actual level of contribution hasn't slowed down. Like the project has kind of diversified enough to have new people coming in. And OpenTelemetry is actually going through kind of let's call it a similar exercise, where I think OTel at least has a bit of a different story to tell because there was let's call it multiple projects and kind of things involved. So the project has, let's call it, many parents or many many folks that but it's kind of going through a similar cycle where
galaxies merging.
Exactly, right. So I think when we were doing the report, we were looking at obviously I think we had Splunk, Microsoft, Lightstep, Google. I think Dynatrace were the top overall contributors to the project, and I think that made up roughly let's call it 60% or so roughly of the contributions, if I recall, and the other 40% obviously are coming from startups, individuals, vendors, and so on. So to me, it's like having it's a healthy dynamic overall, and it kind of has those characteristics of a growing healthy project. Contributions are mostly from kind of the US and I think Japan, and the rest of it is all over the place overall. But we'll share the journey with everyone at KubeCon Europe timeframe to kind of dive in and look at the data yourself. But we have a lot of other examples like Envoy, Prometheus, and Kubernetes on our website that folks could take a look at. But I think everyone involved in the project should be very proud because it is very difficult to kind of get to that state where you have more companies involved and kind of contributing, and the project hasn't slowed down. It's the crazy thing.
It's still the second most active project in the CNCF, second only to Kubernetes itself. I think that's very impressive.
It's crazy in many ways. So we do the velocity reports, and I was pulling one up. I think it was almost last year, and I was like, wow, OpenTelemetry has kind of grown significantly. I think Kubernetes gets about 3,700, so close to 4,000 unique kind of contributors overall, and OpenTelemetry I think was floating around 13, 14, 1,500, that kind of range. So definitely not as large as Kubernetes, but it's clearly second overall in the CNCF ecosystem. And then you kind of have Backstage, Argo, Prometheus, and kind of these other projects that are sub 1,000 overall things, but truly impressive. And as someone who's been kind of involved in observability related stuff throughout my career, early career, spent some time in Tivoli, if people remember good old Tivoli back in the day, and some of those classic IT asset management / classic tracking software. It's nice to see the industry finally coming together to at least spec out stuff that works mostly across different tools and just common language, it's so nice to see. And there are some days where I think OpenTelemetry should be more ambitious and not only just focus on the kind of basic, metrics, logs, traces, signals, but why don't we also start coming up with specifications regarding people want to observe potentially the economic impact or environmental impact of a service or workload, and trying to spec that type of effort out, and just kind of making that maybe part of the OTel effort could be interesting. But that's something for the community to figure out. I just have high hopes that someone's going to figure out if you're getting all the other stuff, the next level is basically environmental impact of service where it potentially runs, and maybe cost, predicting it and trying to figure out what it is. These things are all related and part of an observability solution.
And I think even in the pure technical, for example, I submitted end of last year a TEP, an extension proposal for OpenTelemetry to an OTEP to actually include the CI/CD observability using OpenTelemetry to monitor Jenkins, Argo, and any other pipeline, but to make it a part of the semantic conventions, because this is a massive use case that people already are doing that, but there is no standardization on the semantic convention side of things. So you result to what Jenkins community decided or other communities, and then we don't have the power of convergence on a unified language. So, and then there are lots of other cases for that. You mentioned the data observability and databases and others. So definitely, even within the classic technology domain, without going into business levels and FinOps, I think there are lots to do. And actually, I'm curious, for now, OpenTelemetry focuses on the generation and collection side of things. Do you see it expanding towards storage and analytics backend functions?
I think overall, like open source is a natural commoditization engine, right? So essentially what happens is once people get something that they like and they're like, oh, wait a minute, why does this also support, potentially, long-term, and scalable storage, and people show up and potentially propose it and do the work. It wouldn't surprise me at all if this kind of happens. Obviously, we have a philosophy that projects are self-governing and they kind of, forge their own kind of, destiny, but it would not surprise me, if you kind of see this. And, there's this kind of other weird trend where you have, every traditional observability or monitoring company is becoming a security company, and the security company are becoming observability companies. And this stuff, I think, will impact, OTel in a way where it's going to have to support more of these kind of maybe traditional use cases that some of the SIMs, of the world, have built. I have other crazy ideas where I'd like to see OTel go. Like, if you ever done, hey, has anyone ever played with like different query languages, right? Whether you use something from, Dynatrace, or you use something from, data, like all these crazy, or in Splunk, for example, another, Splunk QL, whatever the hell they call it. It's also insane that we have these kind of basically same things. It's a query language to query set of, let's call it observability data in the most generic sense, but they're all different, which makes it a pain in the butt to switch things, train developers, and it's just an added cost where there truly is no advantage for a company to have like its own custom query language. Like, we should work together on this, and whether it's OTel or maybe a sister effort within CNCF that OTel works for, but this is something that I think, maybe is the next evolution of kind of standardization and collaboration in this space. So I don't know if you have experience with these like query language tools that you just like crap, like, context switch between like PromQL.
You need to do Lucene to query your logs, and then you switch to PromQL to query your metrics. And then actually what you're saying is fascinating, because I've been advocating for quite a few years for people to think about observability in not through the lens of the signals, the raw data, the logs, metrics, traces, or even newer data like continuous profiling, but because this is just the raw data. But for me, observability is actually a data analytics problem. It's the ability to ask and answer questions about your system, and being able to query that. And this, in order to change the mindset of people and disconnect from the raw data. And going back to the CNCF, the CNCF multiple observability projects, you see Prometheus, you see Jaeger, for example, but each focused vertically on a specific telemetry signal and data type, which somewhat defeats the purpose of observability as a data analytics problem, being able to ask us and answer questions across the board, horizontally, and so on. So how do you see open observability stack converging and leading into a more holistic solution?
I love that you kind of, I agree with you that, like, I think the user experience or developer experience, however you kind of want to phrase it, of like, the tool to answer problems is what people should be focused on. The signals, the stuff, I think, is less important. But I think the reality of the situation is you always have to start somewhere in a part of the problem space, right? So obviously, Prometheus started, mostly focusing on, the metrics bit, open tracing bit. So you kind of had your little siloed communities that came in and collaborated on these particular issues because that's what they cared about. And at that point in time in cloud native, that made sense. Now that more people are involved and are familiar with PromQL, Prometheus, how those things kind of work, how traces work, which was kind of a nuanced concept for a lot of people, they're now like, oh, it would be great if I had just like one maybe tool or interface that I could kind of, use to do this. And I think you'll see it start happening from, maybe some of the vendors having an interest in saying like, wait a minute, why do we have a SaaS-based Prometheus? Why do we have a SaaS-based thing that, handles, our traces? Why can't we just have the same thing? And that maybe that work will be driven by the kind of desire to have just one thing for people to run. So, but it's going to take some time. These things never, let's say, happen overnight. It's usually one team, individual companies scratching an itch and just making that use case work well. And then someone else kind of comes along and says like, we should integrate these things, or why don't we have a common, spec for this? And I think you're going to see that evolution happen probably over the next year or two in the space. But that's just my perspective based on things, and seeing some of the future projects that are kind of coming into CNCF that are playing a little bit in this space.
No, I agree, and actually, even in wearing my vendor hat for the company I work for Logs.io, it's exactly that, and seeing the different disparate projects out there, but when you bring them under one umbrella, you can then create a much more holistic journey, and the navigation from logs to metrics to you see a spike in your CPU that you want to say, hey, show me the related logs, like a one-click button showing you the other view. It's still just scratching the surface, and we can do much more in-depth things. But this is where I see, putting again back my hat of the open source, I think this is where the umbrella of the CNCF can actually help converging. And for example, in my chat with Alolita, and the magnificent work she did, bringing the Prometheus community with the OpenTelemetry community together to put the OpenTelemetry metrics together was amazing, and just showing this power of bringing the different communities under the CNCF to talk to each other and join forces. Seeing Jaeger, for example, I'm also involved in Jaeger, and seeing how Jaeger put aside the tracers and even the collector and align with OpenTelemetry as a standard SDKs and the collector side. So I'm just wondering how else we as a CNCF can help these projects talk to each other better. Let's put it this way.
It's hard because, I think some people look at these things like, oh, great, Prometheus now collaborated on the metrics support and OTel, and, all good news. But what people don't realize behind the scenes, I was actually, there was lots of fraught interactions there to kind of get that collaboration. And sometimes it takes time. And, I think one fundamental lesson, I've learned is, you can't force necessarily adoption or action of things to integrate or collaborate. And that's kind of one reason why CNCF kind of doesn't do that by default. We've kind of let it happen organically, whether it's driven by end users or vendors. Because if you announce something, let's say like OpenTelemetry before OpenCensus, OpenTracing, Jaeger, and all these other kind of pieces were around, I don't know if the project would have been as successful, because everyone brought something essentially to the party, right? Their experience, whether it was Jaeger with the great kind of UI and kind of just showcasing what is possible, in that space, right? Obviously, Prometheus kind of revolutionized, metrics, support in many ways, and they brought their special bit. So sometimes it's just the timing of things and what's available before those kind of lovely fraught discussions sometimes happen, and it's not it happens to many projects, right? We have what's going right now with the Kubernetes ingress evolution and so on, right? So there's now Kubernetes gateway API, and we have projects in CNCF that kind of have done their own little thing, right? We have MSRE ingress that has kind of done things, Contour. And they all kind of came together and put aside their differences and said, look, we're just going to base ourselves on this API, and we'll eventually sunset, the majority of our project and just kind of come together. And that was not a forced interaction by CNCF. That was us just basically providing the space, whether it is a conference or a formal meeting of the minds, where we kind of bring people, together to kind of, come in. And there was some kind of very fun stories from the early days of of CNCF, and even the open telemetry effort. We hosted a meeting in
peace conference between OpenCensus and OpenTracing.
This was great. We had the Linux Foundation. We had an office at the time in San Francisco, and it was one of those U-shaped tables, right? So it's kind of like U-shaped tables. On one side, we had the OpenTracing folks with their set of grievances. On the other side was OpenCensus at the time, and in the middle it was me from CNCF. I think it was Brian Cantrell from the CNCF TOC at the time, trying to mediate the situation in some ways. And it took a little while, but eventually folks kind of came together, and those are the type of things that we could truly do. But we can't. It's hard for us to force the actual interaction. All we could do is provide the right environment and settings for this kind of natural collaboration.
Yeah, no, I think you gave a great example. No, but these are good success stories. It wasn't easy, but I think it proved both of these. It proved. So I think this is what I had in mind: the way that CNCF can actually facilitate these conversations between the communities and help bring the different perspectives into alignment.
It's awesome. Like there's an effort going right now. I had a meeting earlier this week. I don't know if people are familiar. There's a sandbox project called OpenFeature, right? So I don't know if people have used feature flagging, once in their life. Lots of different solutions out there, many ways to kind of do it. Some large companies, some startups, but same typical problem. Like they're all freaking different, and it's hard to kind of move to these things. And at its essence, feature flagging is fairly simple. You have a feature, you could turn it, on or off. It could be a little fancy. You could run experiments, A/B tests. Like there's definitely things you could do that are a little bit fancier, but speccing that, and they're kind of going through the exercise of bringing people, together and evolving. So we'll see that, and that's actually something also potentially, I think, interesting to the OTel, world in some ways, because observing, feature flags is for sure part of, I would say a modern cloud native stack too.
I used to be a product manager, so this is actually something close to my heart, the feature flagging. But that's a whole different topic. I wonder, by the way, you I know that you're going to a board meeting soon. Any highlights on where we're heading in the big things that you mentioned?
I know CNCF, super exciting. We have a governing board, it's like any other company. You have board meetings and budgets to approve and other stuff. So I mean, the big thing for people to know is, I kind of alluded this to your kind of the previously earlier in the podcast. Sorry, is open source is a global endeavor, right? Like it is true to my heart and the organization that open source comes from everywhere. Contributions come from different countries, different parts of the world, and our goal is to continue and cultivate and invest in that. So we're doing some kind of investments in terms of ensuring that we do more regional events. We're bringing, obviously, outside of the lovely Kubernetes community days that are blossoming all over the world, we're working to fund those, provide scholarships. We're also doing, let's call it, can't do KubeCon everywhere, but we could do smaller versions called Cube Days. So we're doing, some of those events this year that we're kind of investing in and kind of supporting. This year we're going to be in Tel Aviv in June for Cube Day, and Bengaluru in India later this year too, and potentially maybe something in the Asia region, which we're trying to kind of figure out. But in general, meeting people where we are, trying to also cultivate local regional communities is a huge investment, for us. The other kind of less interesting or kind of maybe boring topic is like security. CNCF, we probably spent a couple $1 million in the last, few years doing audits, fuzzing, a bunch of stuff behind the scenes that people kind of don't realize that, we do license scanning, and full audits that we pay lawyers to kind of go through and crawl to make sure everything is basically compliant and built for, commercial consumption and user consumption. So we're investing heavily more in those kind of efforts to ensure that our projects are secure, because, when Log4j or Log4j, happened, basically the whole world was distracted for like, a week, technically more than that, but like a big focus. And you could argue, like, if you looked at that particular issue, if fuzzing was particularly implemented for that, it may have caught that issue, or maybe an audit would have done it. You never know. But like just having that continuous practice of, let's call it continuous security audits, and pressure is not the right word, but like focus, like essentially projects are aware, making sure they could actually go and fix a CVE, do things. And we've seen this like pay dividends already, where I'll share a story with the Argo project. Argo was running into some issues where people were unhappy with them, but like the team working on the project actually like never really had a like open source security process before. And so that security audit actually helped them evolve that and do it. And now they're just like very good at responding issues. And so we're probably triple downing our investment on, improving security across the CNCF ecosystem through audits, salsa audits that we're doing. We're also going to announce that we are going to also do Cloud Native Security Con again next year in a much
nice.
larger setting. For a lot of people that aren't familiar, we hosted that event earlier this year as an experiment because when you go to KubeCon, there's a lot of co-located events. There's, there's like, there's
even
there's
now after we
working
consolidated some of them.
Yeah, and so the security one, we figured it was large enough that we could kind of let them kind of fly, and it's like fly on your own a little bit, and it was very successful. And we're going to probably double to triple the size of the event next year because KubeCon is just it's become such an interesting event for me because it tries to be everything to everyone, which is a little bit challenging, for us. But we try our best by doing colos that are focused. But our audience profile has been fairly consistent, where 50 to 60% of the people are brand new, almost every time. And I think people sometimes forget that, where like yourself, you're very like knee deep in the observability space and like planning for future, and there are still companies out there or people that are just like legitimately brand new,
they come for the 101s.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, we have some folks that are like, we are thousands of clusters like into Kubernetes and rolled out. Like, I want to reevaluate my security practices. What do you have for cost management that we could take about? Like, and so like we're trying to figure out how to break these things up. And it's going to take some experimentation on our part. We'll probably make some mistakes and like kind of learn from them. But the cloud native security was a good effort, and it seems a lot of those folks are very cordial and working kind of together. Great to see. But yeah, boring board meeting. We'll approve the budget, focus more money on making sure our community is supported globally. Through a variety of scholarships. We want to fly more of our maintainers to events to speak to kind of make up for some of the budget shortfalls that are in the industry, and honestly trying to improve security. It's so critical. A lot of people, I talk to new folks sometimes, and people truly don't realize like every website you almost hit is running Linux. Probably a good shot, powered by some Kubernetes in the background. Their ops team's probably using some form of Prometheus or type of technology. So it's like it's just truly all around us, and it's our job as a community to not only work on the stuff that we care about, but doing the best we can to ensure that all this stuff is kind of secure in some way. So that's kind of my rant on the what's going to happen in the next CNCF.
It makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense. And in the context of the community side, the diversification and meeting people where they are, I want to know personally on the Kubernetes community days. I think this is an amazing program, and I'm actually excited to share with the audience that next week, for those who are in the live stream, we're going to hold the first Kubernetes community days in Israel, which was initiated by myself and some other organizers of the local CNCF chapter. So really exciting to see that, and being on the channel also with the other KCD organizers, and I see the vibrant communities there and the sharing of knowledge, and that actually allows to reach out, and each community is in a different stage in its maturity life cycle. More are already security focused, more advanced, more on the 101. So it's also complementary to the centralized Kubernetes, to KubeCon, to have the localized community activities. That's amazing.
We're so excited. Like we were a little bit, we were kind of coming up with like a scaling problem where, for a while, I think the first 3-4 years of CNCF, I put in almost like 300,000, miles a year of air travel, which is crazy, right? You just can't be in every place and kind of work with everyone. So you have to scale things somehow. The challenge with scaling is, if you lose a bit of, let's say, control, can you sometimes trust the community to kind of do things that are upheld to the, community standards to ensure we, are welcome to all, are diverse, inclusive. We don't favor one project necessarily over the other. And it's been refreshing to kind of see, like, we've definitely made some mistakes on the KCD side, but we've learned from them and improved the processes, and people shared their lessons, like you said, and it's truly blossoming to be kind of an amazing program. And I'm happy to kind of see us continue to invest there, and kind of, it kind of comes back to, there are some folks that come to me, it's like, oh, I want to contribute to CNCF, but how do I do it? Like, I'm really good at programming, or I don't know how to code, or I don't know Kubernetes enough. I'm like, you could provide a translation. We have a cloud native glossary, glossary.cncf.io. Go learn some terms and maybe provide a translation. Host an event. host a KCD, and that kind of philosophy that contribution comes from everywhere, I think has truly made us a very like amazing community in my opinion, of how people just like, it's like developers are not just held at a pedestal. People that contribute events, marketing, translations are also part of this kind of global cloud native family, which is I'm happy for it as someone who's experienced other communities that maybe were not as welcoming in the day to non-coding contributors. It's nice to kind of see this finally happen, and maybe it's a bit of penance on my end for like earlier career mistakes of maybe not being as open as we should have been. So.
Yeah. And by the way, it also came out in discussions this week at Force Backstage, the ability to not be exclusive, but rather inclusive. And we tend to think about ourselves as maintainers and contributors that we're open for everyone, but oftentimes we don't see that we're actually quite exclusive in the way that we approach. So I think it's a valid one. I wanted to ask you, you have a very impressive mileage with open source in general, not just from the CNCF, for many years, both from the vendor side, promoting open source within companies and other foundations. So, and we've seen various relicensing moves in open source community in the past years, and some other, let's say, I call it open source citizenship issues by vendors primarily. And I'm wondering, for me, it's a concern about it creates cracks in the community when things such as that happen. Even within the CNCF, when you see a project, the CNCF project being then forked and taken off and splits the community. So I'm wondering how you view these recent actions, and how do you see any plans to help reduce that?
Yeah, it's a difficult problem because at the end of the day we are essentially neutral IP holders of the code, the trademark, and so on, right? But we generally don't provide the actual engineering resources on those projects. That generally happens from companies, startups, large companies, and the only way to prevent something like that happening when you kind of have liberally licensed code, whether it's Apache, MIT, is to ensure there's essentially multiple parents or multiple owners, right? Generally, if you have a project that more than 80% of the contribution comes from one company, that potentially is a systemic risk. If they decide to pull people away, they may just pull people away and the project will die, or they may fork it and create another project and essentially change the license from maybe something more liberal to something a little bit less permissive, essentially. And we've kind of had that happen in the observability space, which I don't want to call out a particular company or not on this, because I think if you make a business decision, you make a business decision. But there are some things that happen, like the fact that the code is hosted by a foundation, right? It does allow people to potentially sometimes come in and participate, right? Like no one's blocked. People step away. CNCF tries to always ensure that the governance facilitates new people to potentially recover and take over the project, but that doesn't always happen. The only true fire solution, I think, this problem is ensure multiple folks are involved and not one company has too much of a majority, and that takes time, and not every project kind of always gets there. It took Kubernetes a little while to get there. Prometheus took a little bit while to get there. OTel, took a little bit while to get there, and these projects now you could trust because there's lots of diverse interests. One person could go, or one company go fork things and kind of go for it and say the hell with this community, but the fact that there's already a diverse base of folks involved, they could kind of band together essentially to ensure that things are still healthy. Like I've never seen it really happen in projects where you have good contributor and maintainer diversity. It's generally only happen, especially if the code is hosted by a foundation. If your project that you're depending on is not hosted by a foundation, obviously always a risk, more so than the code being in.
That's for sure. And actually, I even wrote a blog post years back. I called it "Is vendor-owned open source an oxymoron?" Because that's a risk, and definitely we've seen a major, even well-established over 10-year-old projects that people say, "Oh, no, it won't happen. This is already a done deal. This is a given fact," and no, it's not a given fact. could be pressure by investors. It could be even public companies or whatnot, and it is an issue. So the question is, when it happened with vendors, that say, okay, you knew that your project is a vendor-owned project, but when you see that happening to a project under the CNCF, then it made me thinking how we as a community and as CNCF can help this project reach this healthy state. So just my thoughts there.
It's super tough chips and all these other types of things to kind of really help out things, but it's generally you're not going to see this happen in a graduated project, because one of the criteria is a healthy diversity committer maintainer base. But for the earlier stage projects, it is a possibility. And I do sometimes we may have a messaging problem where we do have 3 levels, right? Or technically 4 if you count archive, but like sandbox, incubating, graduated. Sandbox projects, technically, like, we kind of treat them like almost like a venture capitalist would be like an investment, right? There's a lot of them, and some of them fail, some of them don't. The challenge I think we have is I don't necessarily think the external community always views it that way, especially if you're like an end user or something. They see, oh, CNCF project, probably pretty good, but that's not always true. I always tell people, treat Sandbox as an experiment, lots of great things to learn from, potentially help out, but make sure it kind of gets to that next level, and preferably graduated, where there's a much stronger seal of maturity where that type of situation can't happen. And honestly, like, demand more of your vendors. Like, if you're depending on something that's in CNCF and it's a little bit too much one company, talk to them, help them out, like hold them accountable. I think it's good to kind of put pressure on them to try to diversify, and sometimes the TOC, our technical board, does push back. Like, if a project goes to graduation, they're like, too much one company, they push back, and project comes and it becomes a healthier. We've had a couple cases where that has
no, but I think what you said maybe is some sort of a takeaway by first clarifying to the end users what it means, a sandbox project, maybe better clarity to align expectations on that, because like the CNCF stamp there is not the same stamp as it is on the incubation.
Correct.
Or definitely not graduate. So maybe understanding this level better, and on internally, what I'm saying is, because we put, for example, OpenTelemetry is a sandbox project. That's a massive project, lots of contributors and already companies. So when you have in the sandbox project both huge, massive sizes project like OpenTelemetry and then tiny projects with a couple of maintainers or something like that, it may make it very vague what sandbox boundaries are. So I'm just wondering again out loud, if we may create more clarity ourselves to help the end users understand it.
It's tough. Like, we've tried. I mean, I would love ideas from the community. If folks have ideas of how to make this easier, because essentially, the graduation, incubation, sandbox levels are an inherent, like, they're a maturity stamp. They don't necessarily reflect project quality, and that's like a nuanced distinction that sometimes is hard to tell to like explain to folks. It's like, things like Istio, OpenTelemetry, obviously fairly decently adopted projects, but they're not graduated yet. They're working towards that. It's just a reflection of like how clean is their governance, how mature some of the open source processes are, and did you have an audit and so on. That's less reflective of how widely that project is adopted. It's hard. Like, maybe we need new badges or new names. Like, in the early days before Sandbox was a thing, there was an idea to almost do something like, if you're familiar with like the Apache incubator, basically having like a separate brand. I think at the time we were like discussing like cloud native labs, right? This would be a cloud native lab project, and there would be separate CNCF projects where they were incubated and graduated, but we decided not to go that route, and instead did the Sandbox incubation and graduation tiering. But
actually,
I'm all
we
ears.
have an interesting question from the audience exactly in this context. The question is there a way out of graduation if diversity goes away of a project, which is actually a very good question.
Yeah, so interesting. So the TOC that has full rights to move project maturity level. So absolutely, like, we could have a request that a project essentially, could move down a level or archived. I don't think it's happened yet for a graduated project, but we've definitely had things like Rocket and Brigade as two examples of projects that were archived not so long ago overall. But yeah, hasn't happened yet, but definitely a possibility. Actually, I would love to see this potentially happen, because it may, like, software changes so fast that we may have a project that essentially was graduated and super effective maybe for that time slice for maybe like 5 years, and then something new happened, right? Maybe people rewrote everything to take advantage of like eBPF that it now exists everywhere, and the old stuff doesn't work well, and the new thing. So I think CNCF is built to handle that case, and once it happens, I would actually be very proud to see it working. But there's nothing that prevents this from happening outside of, like, I don't know, maybe vendor politics. Some like competitive vendors like wanting to offer an archive proposal for something they're unhappy with, which wouldn't surprise me either. But I think the vendor politics have died down over the years, which is lovely to see.
There's another question from the audience. Can CNCF offer project health dashboards?
Yep. So good news, we have some basic ones available. So we have one thing that we built into DevStats. If you go to projecthealth.cncf.io, it is probably one of the ugliest Grafana dashboards that you'll come across your life, that spans a lot of columns, but you can go there. And that's kind of a rough dashboard that the TOC and CNCF staff occasionally use for just like checking for things like, oh, if the project hasn't had a commit in a year, that's probably an issue, or the project's getting 99% contributions from one company. So there are some stuff there that you kind of look at. We are looking to invest in building newer tools in this space to kind of make it a little bit more, let's call it automated, outside of us having to kind of go scour a Grafana dashboard that we populate.
Yeah, that's great. And I want to say thank you. We're about to run out of time, so maybe just if you want to share where people can follow you. That you have the best Twitter handle, so it's easy. But tell where we can find you, where we can follow, and some tips for the KubeCon visitors.
So one, not always the best handle, because it's confused with the Canadian Revenue Agency, which is the IRS. It's a tax body of Canada, so people always upset at it. And then now with the European Union, it's also the name of the Cyber Act, Cybersecurity Act, which also people are not fully happy. So, but yeah, lovely. It's my initials at the end of the day, so I've kind of stuck with it. So follow me at CRA, both at Twitter and Macau Social. You can easily find me just Googling. If you're able to spell my last name, you'll be able to find me. And for KubeCon, good news, it's going to be busy this year. So right now, we're expecting somewhere between 9,000 to 10,000 people on site, which will be record-breaking attendance for us.
Amazing.
It's also made hotels a little bit difficult. So we're constantly working to adding more room blocks, but I would book your travel early, look at Airbnb and whatever hotels we have, because we're going to have record-breaking attendance this year at KubeCon. I think a lot of people have assumed that, given the macroeconomic and kind of global conditions, things would slow down. We even made that assumption, but it just seems that cloud native is such at the forefront of companies, right? Like, you look at the data, cloud spend still is only 10% of like the $4 trillion IT spend and like, overall in the market. So we're still early days. And then sometimes I don't even recognize this. And it sometimes requires like talking to a old bank or something to remind me that we are still early in the cloud native journey. So for KubeCon, show up, be prepared. There's going to be a ton of people. It will be our largest event in Europe by far, probably close to 10,000 people, or maybe a little bit more based on current trajectory. So look for me there. Happy to kind of see you. I'll be going on a couple morning runs if people like to run along the lovely Amsterdam canal system. But look forward to seeing all y'all there.
And you have your keynote for everyone. Make sure not to miss your keynote.
On keynote, if you have great case studies of people that have kind of come through the cloud native community as a early contributor, mentee to now project maintainer, I would love to hear from you, because we have so many great examples out there, and I would love to highlight some more of them. So if you have anything, please let me know. Otherwise, thank you so much for hosting me. I'm so happy that we're able to make this happen.
Thanks so much, Chris, and looking forward to also seeing you next month at KubeCon in Amsterdam.
There'll be some announcements. Yes.
Yeah,
Next
we're
KubeCon
going
is
to have
when
some
a
announcements.
special.
And as I said, we're going to also broadcast the episode of Open Observability Talks live from the show floor. So you'll get some announcements also through the podcast for those who are unable to attend. Thanks a lot for joining me, Chris. And thanks a lot for everyone there at home for joining us. That's all for today's episode of Open Observability Talks. And as always, all the episodes are on the favorite podcast apps and also on YouTube. We're streaming the episodes live. So if you are listening for that on podcast apps, do know that we live stream on Twitch and YouTube. Just follow us on Twitter at OpenObserve to get the times and everything. And if you have something interesting and you're part of the community, you want to contribute, just submit a talk proposal, openobservability.io website. You have an open CFP. More than happy to have more community members contributing. Thank you very much for listening. I'm Dotan Horvitz, and see you next month. And may the open source be with you.